Psalm 68 is so deep and so rich, and there's so much imagery that we won't have time to get into in detail, but the main idea is that God is dwelling with his people, leading them through the trials of the wilderness and bringing them in worshipful procession up to his holy mountain in the promised land, where they get to live and dwell with him as a family in Jerusalem forever. Now notice in verse 1, it says, "Let God arise, let his enemies be scattered, and let those who hate him flee before him." This is a direct quotation from Numbers chapter 10 and verse 35, when after they met God at Mount Sinai and they spent a year with him there, God begins this journey through the wilderness to the promised land. And it says in verse 35, it came about when the Ark of the Covenant set out that Moses said, "Rise up, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you." So the Ark of the Covenant represented the throne of God. And as he leads the Israelites as their king, he's guiding the way through the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. And he's fighting all of their battles for them so that any enemy they face in the wilderness along the way to the promised land will be completely scattered, so that there's a clear path for Israel to finally arrive in Jerusalem on Mount Zion to live with God in peace forever. And that's what we see later in Psalm 68. In verse 24, it says, "They, being the enemies, have seen your procession, O God, the procession of my God, my King, into the sanctuary." And then the psalm ends in verse 35, "O God, you are awesome from your sanctuary." So Psalm 68 traces the movement of the Ark of the Covenant from Mount Sinai to Mount Zion in Jerusalem. So now that we see the big picture of this psalm, it's easier to understand the rest of the verses. Notice in verse 2, all of God's enemies are fleeing. They're melting like wax, and they're being driven away like smoke. And the righteous are rejoicing at God's protection, and they're singing praises to God as he rides through the deserts. This idea of God being a rider, it's like he's on a war chariot. Some translations of verse 3 says that God rides on the clouds. And this is probably a contrast with Baal, because Baal was the main Canaanite god who was believed to be a rider on the clouds, to be in control of the rain and the lightning. And yet Psalm 68 is saying, no, the one true God of Israel is the rider through the skies on his majestic clouds. But the unique thing about God over all the false gods of the nations is that he cares about the vulnerable. The false gods would surround themselves with the mighty and powerful because that would make them look more mighty and powerful. But for the one true God, he surrounds himself with the orphans and the widows and those who are prisoners. He rescues and brings into prosperity. And it's a really powerful image that as God's ark, where his presence dwells, is looking for a place to call home, God is planning to make a home for his people with him. So it's not just God who's going to find a home on Mount Zion. It's all of God's people, especially those who have no home, who have no father or mother, who have no spouse, who are lonely and needy and are searching for somewhere to belong. And in verses 7 through 10, it's God who again is in control of the rain. As he marches victoriously through the wilderness, the heavens are dropping rain, and even Mount Sinai was terrified at his presence and is shaking. And then he brings his people into this wonderful land of promise, and he provides for the needy. Even women in verses 11 and 12 who don't go out to battle actually enjoy the spoils of victory because God is the one fighting for them. And it's like God is not only hiding his people in his wings like a dove, but God's wings are covered in gold and silver. And so God's people are not only safe, they are prospering under his protection. And we have no idea in verse 14 why he makes reference to snowing in Zalmon. Zalmon was a mountain that was covered by forest. And so it could just be that snow covering a forest was a poetic way of envisioning God scattering his enemies all over the ground. Now in verses 15 to 18, he compares Mount Bashan with Mount Zion. And Mount Bashan is a huge mountain. It's way taller. And yet that's not the mountain that God chose. He chose Mount Zion, which is just a tiny little hill compared to Mount Bashan up north in Israel. And yet that's what God does. He so often chooses the lowly things in life because humility is the true source of power in his kingdom. And once he ascends high up on his mountain with his tens of thousands of angelic war chariots. People bring God gifts. Those that used to be God's oppressors and the oppressors of his people are now humbling themselves and bringing gifts and laying them at God's feet. In verses 19 through 23, God blesses us. He bears our burdens. Some translations say in verse 19, he daily loads us with benefits. And it doesn't matter where his enemies go. If they flee in verse 22 up to Mount Bashan, or if they flee down to the depths of the sea, God will find his enemies and he'll bring them to his people so that his people can defeat them. In verses 24 to 27, we have this procession, probably referring back to 2 Samuel 6, when David leads the Ark of the Covenant into the city of Jerusalem in worshipful procession and celebration, because now God has finally come home, and now God's people are finally at rest from their enemies and can be at home with him forever. And the psalm ends like Psalm 47 and 48, with all the nations, even wicked nations like Egypt and Ethiopia, even the worst of beasts and bulls out in the world, which are just metaphors for wicked people, great and small. They're all praising God along with the righteous, because God is awesome from his holy sanctuary on Mount Zion. And so the practice for us is to realize that God's presence doesn't just dwell with us. His presence is always on the move in our lives. As Christians, we're on a journey through the wilderness toward the promised land. We're like the new tabernacles of God, where he dwells within us and is leading us to his eternal home. He's trying to bring us to new heights spiritually. He's leading us to get outside of our comfort zone, to leave behind our old life and to press into new territory for him. And even though it can be scary, we know that God is leading us in battle and he will fight all of our victories for us. And this points to Jesus, because the Ark of the Covenant represented the presence of God in the tabernacle. And Jesus in John 1 is said to have tabernacled among us. And so Jesus came to be the presence of God, leading us victoriously against all of our enemies. And even though, yes, he was killed on the cross, he did what Moses said back in Numbers 10 and verse 35, and what Psalm 68 and verse 1 says. He arose so that all of his enemies would be scattered. And his goal now is to lead us into the eternal promised land, into the eternal Mount Zion, to dwell with God forever. Jesus said in John 14 and verse 2, I go to prepare a place for you. And the Bible ends in Revelation 21 with that place that Jesus prepared. In verse 2, I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared or made ready. It's the same word in Greek, as a bride adorned for her husband. And that prepared place comes down out of heaven to rest on God's holy mountain, where we can live with him in peace for all eternity. And so we praise God for sending Jesus to prepare a home for us in his holy habitation, a home for people who were weak and needy and vulnerable and spiritually homeless. And our prayer today is, Father, help me as your new temple to always be on the move for you, to always be pressing on and trying to make spiritual progress and bring more people into your kingdom and praise your name more with each day that passes. Help me not to be stagnant and to sit still, but to always be moving toward my eternal home with you.